All right, I'm going to just introduce myself. So my name is Ann Wall. I was born Ann Wall. I don't use my maiden or my married name at work. I am a Low German speaking Mennonite from Mexico. I was born on a colony in Durango, actually La Honda. My family's from Durango, and moved to Canada when I was 3. We initially moved to the Leamington area for a very brief time, and then settled in the KW area until I was about 10, and then moved into Elgin County. And I've been here most of the time since that time. So I am actually, we'll talk a little bit about this later, I'm the only girl with 5 brothers. I'm waiting for the sympathy. Yes, it was like that. So I'll just tell you one quick story. My parents, we didn't talk about sexuality or how babies are born when in our Mennonite families. And I wanted a sister so badly. And I would beg my parents. I'd say, when are you going to have a sister? When can I have a sister? My dad would get out the Sears catalog. Yeah. And we'd pick a sister. We'd go through the whole book. I'd pick a sister. My dad would pick up the phone and pretend to order the sister, and the sister never came. That's how we deal with sexuality in our community. So I married a local Mennonite boy. I went to college, then to university. And for the past 20 years, I've been working at Family and Children Services in St. Thomas. I started my career there as a family support worker, then I did foster support. That was essentially working with families and helping them with their child management strategies with children either in the parental home or in foster care. And then in 2001, our agency experienced a social phenomenon. It was actually a media fiasco. So I don't know if I could date this for you guys, but do you remember seeing pictures in the newspaper of some policemen carrying children out of a home? Yeah, that was us. We had a really, really brave manager who took a look at that instance and said, we don't want to repeat that. That was not good for us. We made global news. What she did at the time was took a look at what we were doing with this community, the other community in Elgin County, and looked at our numbers. Our Mennonite children, Low German speaking children, were overrepresented in care, much like First Nations children are in other agencies. So take a look at that. And how do we want to do work, our work? How can we keep children safe in Elgin County? And so what she did, she has no idea how brave she was. She went to the biggest church in Elgin County. Who are we dealing with the most often? In the Old Colony. And so she asked the church eldership, could we have a meeting? And she, all by herself, with 21, 22 Old Colony church elders, developed a protocol. The protocol, in short, indicates that whenever we're involved with a family from the Old Colony church, we are to invite the church elders to be a part of that process. So if it's the investigation, they attend the investigation. They attend any family meetings throughout. If children need to be removed from their parents' care, we consult with the church elders. Often they could find homes for them. That was the intent of the protocol. So she created this wonderful protocol with the Old Colony Church, and then nothing happened. Nobody did anything. It just wasn't implemented. And so then she took a look again. So what do we need to do differently? Let's hire one specific person whose job it would be to make sure that this protocol works and who can make sure that it engages properly with the community. And so that was my position. I got hired for that and did that for 10 years. Since that first initial protocol, we developed protocols with the conservative Mennonite church, the Amish church, and have informal working agreements with the other Mennonite churches in our area. So that's a little bit about me. Having said all of that, I'm going to give this disclaimer. The opinions of this Mennonite do not necessarily reflect that of the greater Mennonite community. So my presentation here will be inevitably skewed by my own opinions, my own experiences, the knowledge that I've sought and attained. And so please don't see this as golden rule for every Mennonite family that you're going to work with. Please find out what their story is and how they understand their community and the strengths or the weaknesses that they see within their own family and community. So why do we ask you to come to things like this? There are approximately 60,000 Low German speaking Mennonites in Southern Ontario. I did get that confirmed with Bill Jansen, who is, if anybody knows, it's going to be Bill, the number of people. And so he, earlier in my slide, it did say 45,000, which was a number I had gotten, but he estimates that it's closer to 60,000. So that's across all of the different counties in southwestern Ontario. There are, in Elgin County, we have a population of about 60,000. It's estimated that there's approximately 10,000 of them are Low German speaking or descendants of Low German speaking families in Elgin County. So there can be Mennonites like myself, who you might not necessarily know are Mennonite by my outward appearance, to people like my mom or the women that are coming from this church here that look very conservative, and you can identify them by their dress. And so I think with understanding this population, I think your jobs will be easier. So that's how I'm going to catch you. That's my lure. So we'll talk a little bit. I know that Dr. Steiner talked about some of this, and so I don't want to repeat too much, but we're going to talk a little bit about the migrations and the migrations that have impacted us since, for those of us that are settled into southwestern Ontario. So as Dr. Steiner talked about, the Mennonite movement started with the Anabaptist movement in Switzerland in the 1500s. Because of the persecution that group experienced, we migrated and moved in typically mass migrations throughout Europe, Germany, Poland, Prussia, Russia. So we were invited by Catherine the Great to settle some swampland in Russia. So speaking in particular to the Low German speaking Mennonites, and settled there for quite some time. And we're fine to stay there for quite some time until the Russianization program started, which basically said that all men, young men, were going to need to serve a term in the military. And so like Dr. Steiner talked about this morning, we're a pacifist community, and so that was a bit of a problem for us. So we sent a delegation of our church leaders and community leaders to Canada to look for land here in the 1800s. And so in the 1800s, we were offered some land in southern Manitoba and Saskatchewan that had been taken from the First Nations communities. And I know that our church and community Mennonite leaders have participated in the Truth and Reconciliation projects throughout Canada in order to hopefully reconcile some of the things that we participated in as a people. So in the 1920s, this is where it becomes a little trickier. And I was talking this morning a little bit about some of these migrations and how that's impacted us. In the 1920s, several things were happening politically in Canada that was impacting our people in particular. So we have the First World War. We speak a language that is German, a type of German. We don't participate in war. Our young men, in fact, were sent to labor camps rather than being into the draft in war. We were also didn't send our children to school, to the public school. And they were insisting that we do need to teach our children English, and that became a bit of a problem. They, in fact, some of our church leaders and elders were fined and jailed at that time. So again, we sent another delegation of people to some other lands to see if there would be another country that might be more hospitable to us. And my people found ourselves in Mexico. So we settled in Mexico in the 1920s. I'm going to backtrack a little bit. Our migration from Prussia to Canada was a mass migration of about 18,000. From Canada to Mexico was another mass migration of about 6,000 to 8,000. Since that time, many Low German speaking Mennonites have been coming back to Canada from Mexico and South America, but those migrations have been family to family, individually based, rather than the mass migrations. So that's really impacted our sense of culture, our sense of our people, when we've stuck together that closely. So for the purpose of this, Dr. Steiner talked about 5 different types of Mennonites. We're going to kind of talk about number 3, the Low German speaking Mennonites. That's the purpose of our day. So there's 3 types of Mennonites with respect to this. family background has your roots, are firmly in the Mennonite or Anabaptist faith, and usually you can identify those by the last name. Clausen, Friesen, Froese, Enns, Wall, Siemens, those kinds of, when I first started at the agency, my boss was not Low German speaking, and he was not from this area, so he wasn't familiar with some of the last names that we have. So he was like, how do you know if they are Mennonite? And I'm like, just look at their last name. What do you mean, just look at their last name? I don't know what that means. So I literally, at the beginning of our working relationship, went through the phone book. It was actually a book at the time, and pulled out all of the Low German names, typed that out, and he had that sitting by his desk so he could, oh, yep, that's a Mennonite family. And then invariably he would bring me the file and he would say, do you know that family? I'm like, no, there's 10,000 in Elgin County. I don't know everybody. And then most of the time I did, right? So that's one way. Historical. Cultural. This is that ethnic affiliation based on that shared experience. So you remember me talking about moving, our mass migrations from Switzerland and Germany and Poland and Prussia to Canada. Those mass migrations, all in big groups, have really formed or helped to inform what our culture looks like. And then faith Anabaptist. There are many different nationalities in the Mennonite faith. If you attended our church, you would see people who are Filipino, Hispanic, Heinz 57 Canadian. There's lots of different types of Mennonites. And you could be 1, 2, or 3 of these. So these are many types of Mennonites here. So when we're talking about Low German speaking Mennonites, what are we talking about? Essentially, we're referring to a dialect of German that's used to be referred to as Old Saxon, or Low Saxon. And it was initially not something that was passed on from generation to generation in terms of formal learning. In our schools, we were taught the High German, what you would know as German. This language originated in the plains of Germany, Holland, Prussia, Poland, Russia, and we've maintained that throughout the generations. One of my biggest parenting regrets, I would say, would be not teaching my children Low German. They know how to say tubduk, which is a dishcloth, and when they were little, uppeshi, that meant they wanted to be picked up. So they don't have a whole lot of Low German, although I think my one daughter knows a whole bunch more than we think, because she catches on some of our secrets. So, it's a very wide and diverse community. So when I said earlier the opinions of this Mennonite do not necessarily reflect that of the bigger Mennonite community, that really is what I'm talking about. My experiences have been, or my understanding of my people has been colored by my experience. And so when you're working with a family, it is really important for you to understand where they're coming from, what their experience has been. They may or may not have lived in a colony in Mexico, Bolivia, Belize, Western Canada, Paraguay, in the United States, Russia, or the Ukraine. They may or may not have lived on colony. I was born on a colony. I resided on a colony. We visited family on colonies. My husband was not. He was born in Canada and did not have that same experience. So I'm going to talk a little bit about colonized life because I think that's really what impacts the Low German speaking community here in Elgin County and in southwestern Ontario as a specific cultural understanding of it. So do people know what I'm talking about when I say colony? Kind of, yes? Okay. So lots of people misunderstand colony to mean commune, and it isn't a commune. What a colony essentially is a town. Everybody in that town is Mennonite. So if you were to go and drive down the street of one of the little villages in Mexico, you would see a nice straight path. On both sides of the street are houses. Nice, large, functional farmyard on both sides. Behind that is a little bit of a bigger farmyard where they might have their vegetable gardens or their barns. And then behind that is the farmland that they actually would grow their corn or their agricultural products on. And then that would continue down the street. If you turn the corner, you'd see that same setup. So the colony is everybody is Low German speaking. When we talk about the community life concept, community life is really, really important for those that have been raised on the colony. I'm just going to get to my notes to make sure I don't forget anything. So the community, there is an emphasis on striving for sameness. There's a commonality. There's a commonality in your language, in your dress, in your culture, your gender roles, your church, your school, the routines of your day. The church sets the standard for how you live. Any change that happens in the community is embraced by the church or condemned by the church. So the church really was the person that sets, or the institution that sets the standard for how we do things. Resolving conflict is always done in the context of the church or the ministers of the church. And there's an emphasis on familiarity and tradition. So there's a saying in our language that says, "Vi har inte ämnesstått judon." We've always done it that way. So they'd like to stick to what's in the past. So I'm actually going to talk a little bit about the community life concept in terms of resolving conflict. So a few years ago, probably more than a few, but I don't want to date myself, I had a fight with my dad, and it was a big one. I was angry, he was angry, we yelled at each other, I left, went home. Within about a half an hour, I get a call from my friend Will. My friend Will happens to be one of our church's ministers. And he's like, "So, you had a fight with your dad?" I'm like, what? How do you... In my dad's mind is when you have a problem with someone, I'm not going to go and talk directly to you. I'm going to go talk to the church elders, and they're going to go and talk to you and tell you how wrong you were. Right? And so that was what he did. He went and he called my friend Will, who happens to be my friend and my minister and my same age, right? So called Will and said, we had this fight. And Will calls me. And so through that process, we were able to, Will attended a meeting with me. My dad had his, for lack of a better word, advocate. But we resolved, through the church, we resolved that conflict. The colony life. So I've talked about the colony being very traditional in terms of the setup. Each colony is generally set up in the same way in terms of the homes. There's a large traditional family unit, large functional home with a farmyard. There are structured daily chores and routines. They do not tend to vary too much from family to family if you're living on the colony. I used to tease my cousins that if they didn't do their laundry on Monday like everybody else, somebody would come over and say, "What's wrong with you guys because you didn't hang out your laundry?" Right? So they really do kind of watch each other, and all of the routines are generally the same. Children are allowed to play unsupervised on the colony. So if my 2 or 3-year-old wanders over to that farm 3 doors down, they can be rest assured that neighbor is going to send them back. I know who you belong to. Go on home, right? So there's this sense of really looking out for each other and each other's children. And so that can be a bit of a struggle when they move to Canada and we don't have that same familiarity with our neighbors, and the expectations for supervision are a bit different. There's structured meal times, usually 4 meals: breakfast, lunch, FOSPA, which is nice, good treats, and then a later dinner. I talked about the structured weekly schedule and what that looks like. You've got laundry on Mondays. There might be certain chores that you might go into town on a certain day as well for family business. Family life. Life is lived as a family unit. This is really where I see the difference in our Canadianized families. The family unit is really, really important. And decisions are often made in what is in the best interest of the family, not what's in the best interest of Anne or one particular child or the father or the mother, but what is in the best interest of this family? What decisions do we need to be made? The family has a common purpose, and each of that common purpose is for us all to contribute to the family. So that's where you'll see children engage in work early on in their life. Everybody has a reason for being in this world, and that's to contribute to the purpose of the family, and then eventually have your own family. Independence only comes with marriage. So there is not really that concept of being an adult, going out and living on your own, figuring out who you are, and what you're made for and what job you might want to do growing up, your independence from your family would only come with marriage. Community life. Your dignity and standing in the community is based on who you are in terms of your family, the appearance of your farm, if you have some prosperity, if you have a prosperous farm. There's a great deal of familiarity on the colony. Everybody knows everybody else and everybody else's business. I used to joke with my cousins, because they don't have any TV, that they have to have their own form of entertainment, so they all know what's going on with everybody else. Women are generally protected from the local culture, because this community is separated from the local culture. Typically, the only engagement that you would have with the local culture outside of the colony is for business. So men tend to learn the language of the land a little bit sooner than women typically would. So many of the men from Mexico would be able to speak Spanish and are fluent in that as well. And then the sovereignty of God. So this is a little bit trickier for me to explain, but there is a sense that God, above all, rules the world and does with you what he sees fit. God wills it this way. You'll hear things like God doesn't make mistakes. God has predetermined some things. His doing should not be questioned. He knows, he allows, he can, and we must submit and give in to his will. So that is how they see God. So what that might look like sometimes is passivity when they see adversity. So if this is how God has planned my life to be, why would I do anything different? Why would I try to change that? You especially would see that with children who would be born with disabilities. God made this person, and that person has value exactly the way that they've been created. So they may not try to make that person with disabilities be the best that they can be. Just leave it alone. Leave well enough alone. God has made her or him. So with that, we have some real amazing strengths in our community. This has taken me a while to get to, because I bought into the Western viewpoint that Mennonites had something wrong with us. So I'm going to talk a little, I'm going to try to make some of these points drive home with some personal examples. So strong family values and loyalties. So who you are with respect to the community is really important. I've already talked about that. I use my maiden name at work. For a long time I used my married name, but then when I switched into the Low German speaking Mennonite child protection worker role, I moved to my maiden name, and I did that very purposely. The families that I work with do not care who I'm married to. Every single one of them has asked who my father is. Every single one. They care where you come from. And I think what they do is they kind of put in their mind where you fit. Okay, so if that's her dad, then that, they may try to figure out if I'm related to them, in practical terms, or they may just say, okay, so where are they in their immigration story? Where are they? How long have they been here? And I always joke with some of my old colony. I think that they do that more because there's a little bit of extra forgiveness they give for me because I wasn't taught any better. So they know who my dad is. That's a really important part. One of the things where I've noticed this the most, I'll give you an example. I was working with a family many years ago where we had to remove the children from mom's care due to some addictions. And we placed those two children with their grandparents. And our ministry standards are that we need to supervise that kinship placement for a period of time. And so I was attending the home quite regularly. And every time I was there, grandpa was getting really, I could feel the vibe of anger. He was getting irritated and he was angry with me, and I couldn't figure out quite what I had done to make him upset. So I said to him, I can tell that you're getting upset with me, and I'm not quite sure what I've done to make you upset. Can we figure this out? He says, well, why are you here? Well, and so I explained to him the process by which we have to follow with kinship, and we want to provide some support to him because I know it's really difficult to be raising your grandchildren and your daughter not making choices that you'd like. And he says, oh, well, why didn't you just tell me that? I was just about to call your dad. Oh, okay. So why would he call my dad and not my boss? Because my dad, doesn't matter what age I am, my dad will set me straight. family, loyalty, and values. That's huge. So he was going to call Dad and find out why Anne was doing what she was doing, and my dad wouldn't have a clue. I don't know what she's doing there. But that is really important to note, because how that might impact you. I had, quite a few years ago, I had a police officer call me and wanted to have a gentleman come in for a statement, just to provide a statement. He wasn't in any trouble, he just wasn't coming in. So she would call, and he would, yep, I'll be there, and didn't show up. And so she called and said, do you have any tricks? Do you know how to get this guy in? And I'm like, do you know who his dad is? She's like, yeah, I actually do, surprisingly. I said, well, go talk to Dad. So she went over, talked to Dad, and she called me back the next day. It worked! He showed up! Right? That, it doesn't matter if you're 40 or 16 or 10, you follow what your dad told you to do. Strong work ethic. We'll talk a little bit later about the work versus education. But one of the things we don't do very well in our community is highlight each other's strengths. But one of the things that we do is recognize when somebody's a good worker. That was like the highest praise that you could get when you were a child, is you're a good worker. So that's really, really important. So children learn to work in their play. So one of my earliest memories was, we lived in Kitchener at the time, but we would travel to Leamington for the summer, live in a little trailer there with lots of extended cousins. And my cousins and I, there was about 5 of us that were about the same age, we had to share a row. And so we collectively picked one hamper in a day. So I know we played all day long. I remember playing, but we were playing and working at the same time and taught how to work from a very young age. So where that might be a bit of where I realized actually that we were different in that way was probably when I was about 7 or 8 years old, and somebody said to me, kids aren't supposed to work. They're not? I had no idea. And I think that was the first time that I felt like we did something wrong. And so where I see that more is, just because it's different doesn't make it wrong. So children can learn to work from a very young age. So our children are also seen as competent much sooner than Canadianized children would be. So in Canada, we see our children, as they grow older, they gain more competency. So they're able to, at 12 years old, sign consent for certain things. At 16 years old, they get to learn to drive. At 18, they vote. 19, you can drink. So our westernized viewpoint is it's progressive. As they mature, their brains develop, they get more responsibility. Mennonite children, or Low German speaking Mennonite children, don't tend to be that same way. In a traditional home, you can do things that other children wouldn't be appropriate. So if your legs are long enough to reach the pedals of the truck, go move the truck, right? If you can carry a baby on your hip, carry a baby on your hip. So they're definitely seen as more competent at a much younger age than Canadianized children. And again, this is where I would say, just because it's different doesn't make it wrong. They are able to do very little. They are making do with very little, and they're incredibly resourceful. Some of the work that I've spent with families, I've seen some of their resourcefulness. They can make do with so very little. They learn how to fix things where the rest of us might toss it and replace it. A little bit of duct tape and rope, and they're good to go. There is a strong sense of belonging to a community. So when 2 Mennonites meet, we call the Mennonite game. We figure out how we're related or how we're connected. So if we're not related, then who do you know that I know? So there is that sense of belonging to that community, whether you're conservatively engaged or more liberally engaged in the community. There's still a connection throughout. There is a strong sense of morality, of right and wrong. On the colony, that can be very clear. It can be very black and white. And when you move to Canada, that clarity is sometimes gone. It becomes much more gray. So that can be a bit of a struggle for our people. And there's a willingness to accept hardships, and there's a hope for the future. So there's a desire for families to do better and to have better and to accomplish more. I'm going to talk a little bit about socialization, just because I think this is really important and why we might conflict sometimes with the families that we serve. So child development and role within families. So earlier, I didn't get much of a chuckle, but I was hoping that I would get more. I'm the only girl with 5 brothers. This is where you give me sympathy. That means in our cultural understanding of things, girls are caregivers in traditional roles. So I would often be a caregiver to my brothers, not a parentified child, a caregiver. I did not met discipline. I wasn't monitoring that, but what I would do is make their lunches, get them up for school, those kinds of things. That is caregiving, and there's a difference between parentification and caregiving. You will see the oldest girl in a family very much taking over that role of assisting their mother in caregiving of their siblings. I already talked a little bit about children being part of the larger group, what decisions are made that is in the best interest of the child. I've also talked about children with disabilities being accepted for who they are and how they've been created, and that we are to leave them as they are. There's the competence versus incompetence. Again, we in Canada see our children as being much less competent than Low German speaking Mennonites might see their children. And so it is really important for you to have that discussion with your families about what's your expectation for your children? What do you want for them? Collective versus individualistic. Our community very much is collective. So if you went to the colony, I talked to her earlier, a child wanders down the street and is playing in somebody else's farmyard, they're going to send him back, you know? I remember as a little girl doing something wrong. I'm not going to tell you what it was because I'm so embarrassed by it. But I did something wrong. I was probably about 7, and a lady up the street, 9 houses up the street, came down and told my parents what I did. It was mortifying, but that was part of people looking out for your family and taking care of you. We have a real sense of taking care of each other. You know, when I had my babies, I didn't cook for a month. I had meals brought to me quite regularly. It was the best part of having children. My husband wanted to have many more so that we could have all these free meals. There is also the inherent support that comes from the community. So I'm going to give you an example. Quite a few, 4 years ago, I got an allegation from the community. There was a family that was struggling with some significant issues. The allegations were that there was a grow-op in the basement, that the father had beaten the 2-year-old, leaving significant bruises throughout the body. There were weapons in the home. There were some other ones too that really can't remember at this stage. So I had to attend the home with police. There was no grow-op, thank goodness. We did find the one little pot plant that was well hidden. A 13-year-old boy knew exactly what I was talking about when I was asking about that kind of stuff. But we knew that there was some domestic violence and there was some physical violence that needed to be addressed. So this is, by the time we're out there with the police, this is 8 o'clock at night, and I'm thinking to myself, I have to have a safety plan with this family done tonight. I don't know a woman's shelter that's going to take mom and 9 kids. Does anybody? Nope. We can't sometimes find one for one mom, 1 kid. So I know that I can't go to a shelter. What am I going to do? If we can't get dad arrested tonight and come up with a safer plan, those children are going to be apprehended. That is a lousy, lousy plan in my mind. So in discussion with mom, I asked if we could call the church elders. She gave me permission to do that. On the way to the police station for the children and mom to give their statements, I called Cornelius. I was using my cell phone and driving at the same time. Yeah, I do see him over there. So I called Cornelius Reimer, who's one of the church elders that we deal with quite a bit, and gave him the scenario, the situation. He said, okay, I'll meet you at the police station. So an hour later, he meets us at the police station, and he's got homes for everybody. If we can't have dad arrested and in jail tonight, that would be our safety plan, first choice in terms of safety plan. If we can't have that, we have people in the community who will take this family. You don't get that in the regular Canadianized families. That inherent sense of belonging to a community where you can call out and ask for help and people will come, right? Education versus work. So in our community, I think the focus is more on work, more because of survivalist mentality. So if you lived in the colony, you have to work in order to feed your family. So that mentality, that survivalist mentality, follows you into Canada. So when I was growing up in in southwestern Ontario. I love to read, loved as a child and continue to love to read. I would be reading and my parents would, get your nose out of the book. How's that going to feed your family? Right? They could not see how education was going to pay your bills. So that is a bit of a struggle. They do see that now. And in hindsight, they say, you know, I don't know, I didn't know what you were doing when you went to college. I didn't have an understanding of that system or what that meant. But they're very happy that that's what I've decided to do. I was lucky enough as a child, blessed enough that my parents didn't make me quit school. They were kind of laissez-faire with, well, whatever. It was either work or school, and I was lazy. I was not going to work picking cucumbers in farm life for the rest of my life. That is the hardest work ever. I chose school. My brothers chose to drop out. So I continued throughout school. Not all families have that same permissiveness. So the focus really is work because that feeds your family in the moment. How do you as service providers impact that? We'll talk a little bit later. Pride versus humility. I heard a joke a little while ago about this concept is, you know, I've never met a people more proud to be humble. Yeah, we are incredibly proud. So we are taught to be very humble in the way that we present ourselves, in the way that we engage with other people. So it can sometimes be a bit, it can be a struggle for some families because what that looks like in terms of a family and a child is what I talked about earlier when I said that we don't compliment our children very well or recognize our strengths within our community very well because that would be seen as prideful. So I remember doing recording packages for work and having to write, one of the sections we'd have to fill out was worker interventions. And so I would put bare minimum in there. And my boss would send it, he would reject it and send it back to me and say, I know you did more, you know, put it in there. And then finally I couldn't figure out why it caused me so much internal conflict to do that. So finally I figured it out. It feels like bragging. I feel like I'm bragging when I'm saying these are the things that I did. Right, so that whole thing really comes internalized. I might not physically look like I'm conservative or have been socialized differently, but I was socialized differently. So that part was a bit of a conflict. So we really, when you work with someone, I actually had this happen a little while ago. There's a woman that I worked with who was suffering some significant domestic violence, and her husband was incredible, had some real struggles with addiction to alcohol. She did not want him in the home. So she had her own home, she rented, and she would say, this is my home. If he comes to my home, then he's gonna come sober. And she couldn't speak any English, so what she would do, and we had a very good working relationship with Elgin OPP, she literally could not speak any English. So all she would do is pick 911. If he would show up at the house and he was drunk, she'd pick up the phone and say his first name. And then they would come. And so they would often use the children to translate. And one of the things that one of the officers said to the children, your mom is a very brave woman. And those kids, every single time I saw them for months afterward, do you remember the police officer said this? Your words and how you choose to engage with these people can be such a huge impact. That simple sentence made such a huge impact for this family. Those children saw their mother as strong and powerful, right? So that's pretty amazing. Emotional expression. One of the criticisms I've heard people say about our community is that we are very flat in our affect. And I want you to know that maybe that might be true, but it isn't because we don't feel emotion. It's because we've been taught to contain that emotion, whether it's happiness or anger or sadness, whatever it happens to be. So I'll tell you the story because this is where it, to me, made the biggest impact, and I really realized how flat we might present to people. We had a family funeral. So my dad is a sibling of 14. 5 are full-blooded siblings. My grandfather's second wife is Hispanic. So he has 8 siblings that are Hispanic, Spanish-speaking. So I'll generalize here a little bit with Hispanics. They tend to be very expressive in very many ways, right? So at this family funeral, we have the Mennonite side who is quite solemn, tearful, very upset. They are definitely grieving. I know them, so I know that they're grieving, but they're managing it, they're containing it. And then you have my Hispanic side of the family they're wailing and keening and making a scene. Like, it was this huge difference. But I realized it was just the socialization of how we've been taught to manage and control our behavior. Gender roles. There are very, very specific traditional gender roles in our families. Men are typically the breadwinners, would work outside of the home in order to support the family. Women are the caretakers of the family. Oldest girls help mom with caring for the siblings. Boys have outside chores, girls have inside chores. In my family, there was no such thing. Girls had outside chores and inside chores. My brothers only had outside chores. Yes, feel sorry for me, I'm asking for it. So very, very traditional gender roles. And with that comes the sexuality. This is a very sensitive subject for our community, especially the more traditional families. There are no words for the sex parts in our Low German language. So you can imagine that might be difficult for someone who's trying to teach sexuality and sex curriculum in the schools, but also someone who might be investigating sexual abuse cases. So there are no words. So when I started the Low German child protection worker role, I went to my dad and said, what's the word for penis? What's the word for vagina? And he was quiet for a few seconds and said, if my mother heard you say those things to me, she wouldn't know what to do. So thankfully, my dad was like, well, we've got some slang that we use, but there are no proper words for those pieces. The only word, there's a phrase, it's kind of a saying or a phrase that you would use for the sex act is topkum, coming together, would be the only real word that you would use for the sex act. So there is very little information around sexuality. Sexuality is also very private, so much so that you would not recognize verbally the pregnancy of a woman. So I remember one of my friends congratulating another friend's mom for being pregnant and this mother was mortified. You do not recognize pregnancy to the community because it identifies that you've had sex, I think, essentially, is what it is. You don't do that. When my husband would rub my tummy when I was pregnant with my babies, my dad would shudder, like literally. Like, couldn't handle it, just that is not recognized in any way. You don't talk about sexuality. There's also no recognition of homosexuality in our community. There's not a word for that. There certainly, people generally wouldn't come out as homosexual either. Okay? So what do you need to know? Low German speaking is the proper term that I would use when referring to someone in our community, not Mexican Mennonite. The word Mexican Mennonite really tends to be a derogatory term that has been slung at us throughout our childhoods and our upbringing here. So that is something that can be deeply offensive. One of my colleagues a couple of summers ago was trying very hard, she's not Low German speaking, was trying very hard to enact our protocol, had called the family and said, are you Mexican Mennonite? And she said, I heard a pause. And they said yes. And then so she invited them to invite their church elder to be present at the meeting. And thankfully, this person, quite uncharacteristically, when they attended the home, said, when you asked if I was Mexican Mennonite, that really hurt. And I don't know why you asked that. And so my coworker was absolutely mortified. I am so sorry, I didn't realize that, right? You need to be careful of the language you use. Mexican Mennonite can be seen as a derogatory term. So are you Low German speaking? Are you from the Mennonite community? You know, some are, I know my husband was called a Mexican when he was growing up, and he was born in Canada. I have many Mennonite friends, Low German speaking Mennonite friends from Belize and Bolivia. And there are cultural differences from those areas. So that's a really big, important piece. They may or may not be aware of the greater Mennonite community. My dad just literally months ago found out the reason that we left Canada in the 1920s. And he said to me, I was accused of, so my great-grandfather was one of the delegates that went to find land in Mexico. Well, I'll tell you this story too, it's kind of funny. So he went to Mexico to find land, but they didn't tell anybody why, like any of the future or following generations, why we ended up in Mexico. I could never figure out when I was little why I had blonde hair and blue eyes and I was from Mexico, and most Mexicans have dark hair and dark eyes. Like, I didn't understand that. So I wasn't taught that we were from Russia to Canada to Mexico. So I had no understanding of that. So one of the things here, this kind of highlights the lack of information that we have about the greater Mennonite community. So we would go to Mexico every Christmas. And there's a tradition in our community that when you go to a grandparent's home, you get a little treat bag. And you have to earn that little treat bag by saying a bench or reciting a poem. And so we weren't raised Old Colony or in the Old Colony tradition, so I didn't learn those. So all of my grandparents deceased when I was very young, but we did have Olagrafash, which were our great-grandparents. And so we would go to visit our great-grandparents, and they would have this little treat bag ready for us. And so because we didn't know any poems, any traditional poems, they asked us to sing. So typically we would sing a Christmas carol, my brothers and I, and our family doesn't sing, just so you know. It wasn't probably very entertaining. So one year we thought we would be really clever, and we thought we'll just sing "O Canada." They won't know. It's in English. It's all in English. We're all singing in English. And my great-grandparents sat and nodded and smiled. It was so lovely. And they gave us our treat bags when we were done, and off we went. I found out later that my great-grandparents were born, raised, got married, had their first children in Canada. They were completely English fluent. I had no idea. They didn't let on at all. We struggled with our Low German with them all the time, and they didn't let on. So I was not aware of the bigger Mennonite community. So we have the pride in our core values of marriage, family, and work. Marriage is for life. It's a covenant between a man and a woman for life. So sometimes CAS, in general, has been criticized, especially with families that suffer with domestic violence, in having the violent male removed from the home, and then he's out of our picture, right? I don't have to deal with him. Once he's out of the house, he can stay over there, and I'll deal with mom and the kids. That's not going to happen in our Mennonite community. That's just not going to happen. They do not leave. So we have had, from time to time, men leave the home for a period of time in order to ensure the safety of the mom and the children, but always with the mindset that we are working toward reconciliation, that they will eventually be coming back into the home when changes have been made. Family, like I've said earlier, family is very important. Who you are in terms of your family, who your dad is very important, and the value of work. And work as children contribute to the family's income through work as well. We are often threatened by the unknown and the unfamiliar. So when you come from a colony where everybody knows everybody and the routines are all familiar, everybody's daily routines as well as weekly routines are familiar, the children know the neighbors three doors down, and come to Canada where your neighbors might be very vastly different from you, that can be a real struggle. The grocery store looks different than the grocery store you're used to. Those things can be really, really scary. And then when you have service providers like ourselves coming to their home, they don't know what you do. In the colony, the church is the social system. They manage the care for widows and children, and when there's conflict, like I talked about earlier, within families, they manage those systems. So they don't understand how education is different than healthcare, is different than Children's Aid Society, is different than public health. They get very confused by those things. So that can be very threatening. We are a very passive community, sometimes passive-aggressive, I will admit to that. But there's a non-aggressiveness. And so that when families swear, or service providers swear, and I've seen service providers just do this in kind of day-to-day conversation, especially the use of the phrase, "oh my God," that can be incredibly offensive. And I've actually seen the families I serve kind of jolt back when that phrase is said. So just be very conscious of your language when talking to someone else. Trusting others. So there's a general distrust of any bureaucracy. Distrust of law enforcement. Some of the Mexico and South American countries don't have the most honorable systems. And typically you could bribe your way through some situations, so they might have that same kind of distrust here. Relationship above all else. So one of the strategies that I learned to use very early on in my working with the Mennonite community was that development of relationship and how that can be a very progressive thing. So typically when I would start working with a family, if I knew that if the information was that they were traditional, I would actually do this anyway just because I didn't know where I was or what kind of a situation I was getting into, is I would wear a skirt that was past my knee. I would wear a sweater or a jacket that covered my elbows. I would ensure that there's no cleavage showing. I would take out my earrings and then work with the family. The reason being was that typically they're conservative, and if they're getting too caught up in my appearance, they're not going to listen to what I need to share to them. They're going to be so stuck with what I look like rather than what I have to do, what my job is. So typically I would do that until, usually there would be this moment, and in this case, I'll give you this example. I worked with a woman for about a year and a half. I had done that for a year and a half, wearing a skirt, making sure took off my jewelry, etc. I got to the home one day and she said, I got a call from my cousin in Mexico. And I said, oh, you did? Knowing there's a story here. She said, yep. And she said, I'm going to do this in Low German because I know there's a few Low German speaking in here. De zei dat ik zal children say de nicht aanmoeten. Die willen mijn kinderen wegnemen. Maar ik zei, oh nee, dat is een saai fijne mamke. Ze brukt niet een duik, ze brukt de half oormammels, but ik leg haar in een wis. So that was, she was told, CAS is at your house. I heard that CAS has been coming to your house. Don't let her in. She's going to take your kids. And the mom had said to her cousin, no, she's totally fine. I like her. She has earrings, and she doesn't wear a head covering, but I like her anyway. So, and then she said to me, she proceeds to say to me, she goes, I know that you wear earrings because I can see the holes in your ears. And you don't wear a head covering, and I know you wear pants when you don't visit me. I'm pretty sure you wear pants. She says, you can dress like that. When you come here, you can just come like this. And I could not tell you how many times that's happened. Usually, once that relationship has been developed, they're okay with who I am because they develop the trust. This is how it's going to work for you as well. Your name, your reputation is going to follow you throughout the community. So they know who Ann Wall is, and sometimes they get mixed up with which Ann Wall I am. But typically they go, oh yeah, you visited my sister a year ago, or you were working with my cousin's family. And sometimes I'll get that you should go work with my cousin's family. But that relationship is so important. Who you are and how you develop trust is the most important with making change, and that's where the change is most effective. I talked about resolving conflict. Resolving conflict is always done in the concept or the connection with the church. So use the church. You know, I have gotten a very, very good working relationship with the church elders in the different church communities. So use them. Self-governance, our community does self-govern. So if you go to the colony, like I talked about, there's a system by which you take care of widows and orphans. There's a system by which you should be taking care of the poor. They don't have all of the other systems that we have here. So here's some tips. Find out their immigration story, if they are immigrants, or if they've been born here. Where are they at in that continuum? That's really, really important. Patience, respect, and acceptance. Really, one of the things that I couldn't emphasize more is the time. One of the things that I see service providers from our Western viewpoint do quite a bit is rush through things. You cannot rush a Low German speaking family, and if you do, you will insult them and won't be invited back in. So it is that relationship. Typically, when I would visit a home, it would be the first hour would be spent relationship building. So seeing the garden, seeing the sewing, seeing whatever's going on in the home, right, that kind of thing, and talking about your commonalities or however you do choose to do that. And the other 2 hours would be with the work that I was there to do. So that comes with patience. So if you come in with a ticky box of things that you need to have done, and then you're out of there, they're not going to be very happy with you and they won't want you back. It needs to be done at a much slower pace. Typically, we don't, in our community, interrupt each other. One person speaks at a time. Think before you speak. Our Western view or our Western engagement is a lot of people talking at the same time, and we want to speed things up. I said earlier to watch your language. Oh, actually, I'm going to go back. Don't assume that you've been understood, so use simple terminology. So I'll use this example, and I use this one a lot. My dad. So if anybody shows this video to my dad, I will not be happy. I use my dad a lot. My dad told everybody a while ago that he had prostate cancer. That's a pretty significant diagnosis, right? My brother went to the appointment. He had to have surgery. My brother went to the appointment with him to have surgery, and he called me after that and said, Dad told you had prostate cancer, right? I said, yep. He goes, he doesn't have prostate cancer. He had bladder cancer, which is completely treatable in a totally different kind of way, right? So he didn't know the difference between those two words. So don't assume that they know what you're saying by using that language. Really try to tease out whether or not that's been understood. And he's been here 40 years, 40 some more years. And if you've spoke to him, you would assume, he has a thick accent, but you would assume that he understands a lot of English. Don't make that assumption. And so I said earlier, watch your language. Oh my God is not something that would be well received. That relationship is most important, and developing that trust. If you can integrate God somehow in your conversations, I've had many conversations with families about what do you think God would want you to do in this circumstance? What's your belief about what God would want for your family? Women are not to be alone with men, and vice versa. So often that would cause some extra time for me. If I would go to a family's home and mom was out of the home and it was just dad, I would stand at the front door and reschedule. It is not appropriate for me to be alone in a home with a male. So, and often I would use the church elders if that was the case. So use the church. That was my next one. Use the church wherever you can. There was a really great example that I encouraged one of our attendance counselors to do a few years ago. Is if children weren't attending school, they were completely low German speaking, could not understand what the attendance counselor was saying. Bring the church elder along as an interpreter, both cultural and literal, but they also are then encouraging the idea of education and that it's okay and accepted here in our country. And then use that hierarchy of the family. So it's typically church, dads, moms, and then children. But don't misunderstand dad speaking for mom as domestic violence. Typically what I've seen service providers kind of misinterpret that women are typically silent and men will speak for them when dealing with an outside service provider. But remember, back in the colony, women are protected from the outside. They're seen as being protected. So don't misunderstand that she has probably told him exactly what her opinion is before you got there and told him what to say. But that's just the semantics of it. There is domestic violence, and I won't argue that, but most of the time that's the situation, is he's speaking on her behalf, not controlling her answers. Okay. So that's the end of what we've got. This is our, finish off with my family picture. The picture on your left is a picture of my family just before we migrated. That chubby little girl in the back corner, I can't point to it there, right beside my dad. That's me. And then my mom's holding my little baby brother. And then that other picture is the way passport pictures used to be taken. All of the children with mom. So I have a friend, my friend Will actually, sibling of 15. Can you imagine what that passport picture looked like, right? So that's typically, and that's just as we migrated. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being willing to listen to any wisdom or knowledge that I might have. I appreciate that you want to be here and learn more about our community and how you might be able to serve them better. So thank you.